The train hissed to a stop, steam curling into the Kansas heat, and Caleb Harlan's world shattered in an instant. There, stepping onto the platform in a dust-colored dress, was the ghost of his past, Lydia Moore, the girl whose lips had tasted like creek water and wild strawberries 18 years ago. His first kiss, his first love, his first heartbreak. But before hope could take root, her eyes found his and filled with something worse than surprise. Regret. She'd come to marry another man, and Caleb, who'd built a life from loneliness and dirt, would have to watch her walk away all over again. Stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The depot at Willow Creek, Kansas had never been much to look at. Just a weathered platform, a ticket window with paint peeling like old skin, and a water tower that cast a long shadow across the tracks every afternoon. It was the kind of place people passed through but never lingered, where goodbyes were quick and arrivals were met with tired eyes and dust-covered boots. Caleb Harlan had no business being there that Thursday afternoon in July. His ranch sat 12 miles northwest, and he had cattle that needed tending, fences that wouldn't mend themselves, and a dozen other tasks that justified staying home. But Sam Tucker, the mercantile owner, had mentioned in passing that Frank Dalton was expecting a bride on the afternoon train, a mail-order woman from back east who'd agreed to marry a man she'd never met. The whole town had been buzzing about it for weeks. Caleb told himself he'd come out of simple curiosity, maybe a touch of boredom. The truth, which he wouldn't admit even to himself, was that he'd grown weary of his own company. At 36, he'd built a modest spread through backbreaking work and stubbornness, but the silence of his cabin had started to feel less like peace and more like punishment. Watching another man claim a bride seemed a strange way to spend an afternoon, but it beat staring at his own four walls. The train was late. It usually was. Caleb stood near the water trough, his hat pulled low against the glare, trying to look like he belonged anywhere but where he was. A handful of others had gathered. Frank Dalton himself, stiff and formal in a Sunday suit that had seen better days, his jaw set like a man preparing for an unpleasant but necessary duty. Two little girls clung to his sides, their dresses clean but faded, their faces solemn. The older one couldn't have been more than 8, the younger maybe 5. They didn't fidget or play. They just stood there, small and still, like they'd learned early that joy was something other children had. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house had come too, along with her daughter Ruth. They whispered behind gloved hands, eyes bright with gossip hunger. The station master, old Harold Pierce, checked his pocket watch for the 3rd time, shaking his head at the train's tardiness as if personal offense had been committed. Then the whistle sounded in the distance, lonely and long. Caleb felt something shift in his chest, anticipation, maybe, or dread. He couldn't name it. The iron rails began to hum, and then the locomotive came into view, smoke and steam and the screech of brakes. The train pulled alongside the platform with mechanical indifference, and for a moment everything was noise and motion. Then the doors opened. 3 people stepped off. First came a traveling salesman with a battered case, then an elderly couple who were immediately claimed by waiting family. And then came a woman. She wore a simple dress the color of summer dust, cinched at the waist, with sleeves that covered her arms to the wrist despite the heat. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a small hat, and she carried a worn carpet bag in both hands like it contained everything she owned. Which, Caleb supposed, it probably did. She stood on the platform for a moment, looking around with an expression that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't far from it. Her face was turned away from Caleb at first, and he found himself studying her profile. The straight line of her nose, the curve of her jaw, something about the way she held herself that seemed familiar in a way that made his pulse stutter. Then she turned, and Caleb Harlan stopped breathing. Time didn't slow. That would suggest it still moved. No, time simply ceased. The noise of the depot faded to nothing. The heat, the dust, the other people all vanished into a white-edged blur. All that existed was her face, and the impossible recognition that slammed into him like a kicked horse. Lydia Moore. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Lydia Moore had disappeared from his life 18 years ago, when her family left Missouri in the middle of the night, taking her away without warning or goodbye. He'd been 18, she'd been 16, and they'd known each other for exactly one summer, the summer that had ruined him for any other woman. But there was no mistake. The years had changed her, softened some angles, sharpened others, added a wariness to her eyes that hadn't been there when they were young. But he knew her the way a man knows his own hands, the curve of her mouth, the way she stood with her weight slightly on her left foot, the particular shade of brown in her eyes that looked gold in certain light. His first kiss, standing by Crane Creek with muddy boots and nervous hands, her lips soft and cool, tasting like the wild strawberries they'd been picking. The memory crashed over him with visceral force, the sound of the water, the smell of honeysuckle, the way his heart had hammered so hard he'd been certain she could hear it. She was looking around the platform, searching, and then her gaze found him. For a heartbeat, maybe two, her face went blank with shock. Her lips parted, her eyes widened. The carpet bag slipped from her hands and hit the platform with a soft thud. "Caleb?" she breathed, the word barely carrying across the distance between them. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. His boots might as well have been nailed to the boards beneath his feet. 18 years of carefully constructed walls, of telling himself he'd moved on, of building a life that didn't include her. All of it crumbled in the space of a single word. "Lydia," he managed, and his voice came out rough, unfamiliar. She took a step toward him, then stopped, her hand rising to her throat. "I can't. How are you? Do you know each other?" The voice cut through the moment like a blade. Frank Dalton had moved to Lydia's side, his hand closing on her elbow with possessive certainty. "Miss Moore, do you know this man?" Miss Moore, not Mrs., not anyone's wife, but here for Frank Dalton, here to marry Frank Dalton. The realization hit Caleb like cold water. She was the mail-order bride. Lydia was the woman Frank had been waiting for. She'd come here to marry him. Lydia's eyes were still locked on Caleb's, and in them he saw confusion, shock, and something else, something that looked dangerously close to hope. "We knew each other a long time ago. I didn't know. I had no idea." "Well," Frank's voice was clipped, impatient. He was a hard-faced man in his mid-40s with thin lips and eyes like river stones. "That's a coincidence, I suppose. Miss Moore, these are my daughters, Clara and Beth. Girls, say hello to your new mother." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through everything. The two little girls stared up at Lydia with identical expressions of cautious fear. They didn't say hello, they just looked, with eyes too old for their faces. "Hello," Lydia said softly, crouching down despite the state of her dress and the dust of the platform. "It's very nice to meet you both. What beautiful names you have." The older girl, Clara, whispered something that might have been "thank you." The younger one, Beth, just pressed closer to her sister. Caleb watched this exchange feeling like he was drowning on dry land. Every instinct screamed at him to step forward, to say something, to do something. But what? What right did he have? She'd made her choice. She'd come here to marry Frank Dalton. Whatever they'd been to each other once, it was buried under 18 years of silence and distance. "We should go," Frank said, already turning. "I've got work waiting, and there's a lot to be done before supper. Miss Moore, if you'll collect your bag." "Of course." Lydia straightened, reaching for the carpet bag with hands that trembled slightly. She didn't look at Caleb again. Couldn't or wouldn't, he didn't know which was worse. But as Frank began to lead her away, his hand still on her elbow like he was afraid she might bolt, she spoke without turning. It was good to see you again, Caleb." The words were so quiet he almost didn't hear them. So formal they might as well have been spoken to a stranger. "Yeah," he said, and even he could hear how hollow it sounded. "You too." He watched them walk to Frank's wagon, a utilitarian thing with no comfort to it, all hard angles and splintered wood. Frank helped Lydia up onto the seat with perfunctory efficiency, then lifted his daughters into the back. The girls sat among bags of grain and farming tools, still silent, still watching. Lydia settled her carpet bag on her lap and finally looked back toward the platform. Their eyes met across the distance, and in hers, Caleb saw everything she couldn't say. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. Forgive me. Help me." Or maybe he was seeing what he wanted to see. Maybe she was just looking, feeling the same shock of recognition and nothing more. Frank snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched into motion. Within moments, they'd rounded the bend past the feed store, disappearing in a small cloud of dust. And Lydia Moore, his Lydia, who'd never really been his, was gone. Again. The train whistle blew a departing note. The platform emptied quickly, everyone returning to their lives, their routines. Mrs. Henderson and Ruth were already deep in animated speculation, no doubt planning to spread this delicious bit of gossip across every parlor in the county. The salesman had vanished. Even Harold Pierce had retreated to his office. Caleb stood alone, hat in his hands, staring at the empty space where the wagon had been. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son." He turned to find Doc Whitmore standing a few feet away, medical bag in hand, bushy eyebrows raised in concern. The old man had been the town doctor for as long as Caleb could remember, with a reputation for seeing things other people missed. "Not a ghost," Caleb said. "Just someone I used to know. Must have been someone important." Doc's eyes were kind but knowing. "You've gone pale as fresh milk." Caleb tried to smile and failed. "Ancient history." "Didn't look ancient from where I was standing." Doc shifted his bag to his other hand. "That woman, Miss Moore, Frank's mail-order bride. She knew you too, didn't she?" There was no point in lying. "Long time ago. We were kids. And now she's marrying Frank Dalton." Doc's tone was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. "That sit well with you?" "Doesn't matter what sits well with me." Caleb shoved his hat back on his head, suddenly desperate to be anywhere else. "Her life, her choice. I've got cattle to tend." "Caleb," Doc's voice stopped him mid-turn. "Frank's not a bad man, but he's not a good one either. Lost his first wife to fever 2 years back, and he's been hard since then. Hard on those girls, hard on himself. A woman like Miss Moore, with any softness left in her." He shook his head. "I hope she knows what she's walking into." The words settled in Caleb's gut like lead. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you looked at her like a man who still cares." Doc's gaze was steady. "And because caring, one way or another, tends to demand action." Then he was gone, leaving Caleb alone with words that felt too heavy to carry and too true to ignore. The ride back to his ranch passed in a blur. His horse knew the way, which was fortunate, because Caleb couldn't have directed it if his life depended on it. His mind was 18 years away, back in Missouri, back in that summer when everything had seemed possible. He'd been working his uncle's farm that year, learning the trade, building calluses and muscle. The Moores had lived on the neighboring property, a struggling place with more debt than crops, run by a man who drank more than he worked. Lydia had been the oldest of 5 children, practically raising her siblings while her mother grew more hollow-eyed and distant with each passing month. They'd met at the creek that divided the properties. He'd been fishing badly. She'd been washing clothes. She'd laughed at his technique, then shown him how it was done. 2 hours later, he'd caught nothing, but he'd learned her name, her laugh, the way her nose wrinkled when she was amused. After that, the creek became their place. They'd meet there whenever they could steal time, early mornings before work, late afternoons after chores. They talked about everything, their dreams, their fears, their frustrations with the lives they'd been born into. She'd wanted to be a teacher. He'd wanted land of his own, somewhere he could build something permanent. "Maybe we could do both," she'd said one evening, her feet dangling in the cool water. "You with your land, me with my schoolhouse, side by side." "That'd be something," he'd agreed, and even though they'd been kids with nothing but hopes and empty pockets, it had felt real. The kiss had happened in late August, just before harvest time. She'd been crying. Her father had sold their milk cow to pay gambling debts, and there'd be no cream for the winter. Caleb had tried to comfort her with clumsy words, and she'd looked up at him with wet eyes and said, "You're the only good thing about this place." He'd kissed her then, gentle and unsure, and she'd kissed him back, her hands gripping his shirt like he was the only solid thing in a shifting world. "I love you," he'd whispered against her mouth, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "Lydia, I love you." "I love you too," she'd whispered back. "I'll always love you." 3 days later, they were gone. He'd arrived at the creek that morning to find the Moore house empty, the door hanging open, everything of value stripped and taken. The neighbors said they'd left in the dead of night, heading east, away from debts and shame. No warning. No goodbye. no forwarding address. Lydia had vanished from his life as if she'd never been there at all. For months he'd been useless. He'd worked mechanically, eaten without tasting, slept without dreaming. His uncle had been patient, understanding in his quiet way, but eventually he'd sat Caleb down and told him the truth a young man needed to hear. Son, you can love someone and lose them. That's life. What you can't do is stop living because of it. So Caleb had stopped waiting. He'd worked harder, saved more, built his ranch from nothing. He'd courted a few women over the years, even proposed to one. Sarah Bentley, a practical widow who'd said yes before changing her mind 2 weeks later. You're a good man, Caleb, she'd told him, but I can't marry someone who's still in love with a memory. He'd denied it, of course, but she'd been right. And now the memory had stepped off a train and back into his life, wearing a dust-colored dress and carrying everything she owned in a carpet bag, on her way to marry another man. Caleb's ranch came into view as the sun began its descent. A simple cabin, a barn, fences that marked his hard-won territory. It wasn't much, but it was his. He'd built every foot of it himself, with hands that still bore the scars of that building. He dismounted, tended to his horse with automatic movements, then stood in his own yard feeling like a stranger. Inside, the cabin was exactly as he'd left it, clean, sparse, orderly. Everything in its place, everything functional. Nothing soft, nothing decorative, nothing that spoke of warmth or welcome. It was a place to sleep and eat, nothing more. He'd convinced himself that was enough. Now, standing in the doorway, all he could see was what it lacked, what she would have brought to it if life had gone differently, what it could have been. Caleb walked to the window and looked out at the darkening prairie. Somewhere out there, 12 miles south and east, Lydia was in Frank Dalton's house. She was probably sitting down to supper with those silent little girls and that hard man who'd claimed her like livestock. She was probably trying to smile, trying to be brave, trying to convince herself she'd made the right choice. Or maybe she wasn't thinking of Caleb at all. Maybe seeing him had been nothing but a startling coincidence, a brief shock that had already faded into insignificance. Maybe she'd loved Frank through letters and was happy to finally be with him. Maybe Caleb was the only one whose world had been torn open that afternoon. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass and closed his eyes. Lydia, he whispered to the empty room. What am I supposed to do? The silence offered no answers. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of creek water and strawberries and promises that had dissolved like morning mist. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. Caleb threw himself into work with desperate intensity, trying to exhaust the thoughts out of his head. He repaired fences that didn't need repairing, moved cattle from one pasture to another for no good reason, and spent hours in the barn organizing tools that were already organized. His hands stayed busy, but his mind refused to cooperate. Every moment of stillness brought her face back, the shock in her eyes, the way she'd said his name, the tremble in her hands as she'd picked up that carpet bag. He went into town 3 days after the train incident, needing supplies and telling himself that was the only reason. The mercantile was busy, Saturday morning always was, and Sam Tucker greeted him with a knowing look that made Caleb's jaw tighten. Heard you got quite the surprise at the depot Thursday, Sam said, measuring out nails with exaggerated casualness. News travels fast. News like that? Faster than usual. Sam grinned. Mrs. Henderson says Frank Dalton's new bride recognized you right off. Says the woman went white as a sheet. Mrs. Henderson talks too much. That's the Lord's truth. Sam finished with the nails and moved on to the flower Caleb had requested. Still, must have been something, seeing someone from your past like that. Especially, he paused, his expression shifting to something more serious. Especially someone who mattered. Caleb met his eyes. Sam was a gossip, but he was also a decent man who knew when to tread carefully. It was a surprise, Caleb admitted, but that's all it was. Past is past. Right, Sam nodded slowly. Just seems a shame is all. What does? Well, Sam lowered his voice, glancing around to make sure no one else was close enough to hear. Frank brought her into town yesterday to register the marriage intent with Reverend Thomas. I saw her walking down Main Street, and Caleb, she looked lost, Like a woman going through the motions but not really present, you know? Caleb's hands tightened on the counter. That's none of my business. No, I suppose it's not. Sam wrapped the flower, his movements thoughtful. But those little girls of Frank's, Clara and Beth, they were with her, and I'll tell you what I saw. Miss Moore was holding their hands, talking to them soft and gentle, and they were actually smiling. First time I've seen those children smile since their mama died. That's something, at least. Yeah, Caleb managed. That's something. He paid for his supplies, loaded his horse, and rode out of town before anyone else could corner him with observations and implications. But Sam's words followed him home, painting pictures he didn't want to see. Lydia walking down Main Street, trying to be brave. Lydia coaxing smiles from traumatized children. Lydia registering her intent to marry a man she'd known for less than a week. That night, Caleb sat on his porch with a glass of whiskey he didn't drink and watched the stars emerge. The prairie stretched out before him, vast and dark, and somewhere in that darkness was Frank Dalton's cabin. Somewhere out there was Lydia. He wondered if she was looking at the same stars. Wondered if she was thinking of him at all. Wondered if she was regretting her choice, or if he was just projecting his own hopes onto a situation that had nothing to do with him. The smart thing, the right thing, would be to let it go, to accept that she'd made her decision, that she'd come here for a purpose, that interrupting her new life would be selfish and wrong. She was an adult. She'd known what she was doing when she answered Frank's advertisement. Whatever reasons she had for being here, they were hers. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just seeing her again, wasn't just the shock of recognition or the resurrection of old feelings. It was something in her eyes, in the way she'd held herself on that platform. Fear, resignation, the look of someone who'd run out of options and was making the best of a bad situation. Or maybe he was seeing what he wanted to see. Maybe he was creating justifications for feelings he had no right to have. The whiskey sat untouched until midnight, when Caleb finally gave up on sleep and decided to work until exhaustion made thinking impossible. It was on the 6th day after the depot encounter that everything changed. Caleb was working on the fence line along his northern pasture when he heard hoofbeats approaching. He looked up, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun, and felt his heart kick hard against his ribs. A wagon was coming down the road, and driving it was a woman in a blue bonnet. He knew, even at a distance, that it was her. Caleb straightened slowly, hammer hanging loose in his hand, watching the wagon approach with a mixture of hope and dread that made his chest tight. As she drew closer, he could see her face more clearly, set with determination but showing signs of strain around her eyes and mouth. The two little girls sat beside her, Clara and Beth, looking around with wide-eyed nervousness. Lydia pulled the wagon to a stop 20 feet from where Caleb stood and sat there for a moment, hands gripping the reins, staring at him like she was gathering courage. Then she climbed down, her movements graceful despite obvious exhaustion, and walked toward him with steady steps. "Hello, Caleb," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Lydia." He couldn't think of anything else to say. His mind had gone blank, overridden by the simple, overwhelming fact of her presence. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you." She glanced back at the girls who were still sitting in the wagon watching everything with solemn attention. "To talk to you. Properly, if you'll allow it." "Of course." He gestured toward the cabin. "Would you like to come inside? I could make coffee, or—" "No." The word came quick, almost sharp, then softer. "No, I shouldn't. Frank's in town until evening, and I need to be back before then. I told him I was taking the girls to see the Miller place, to buy eggs. I don't have long." Understanding settled in Caleb's chest like a stone. She'd come in secret. She'd lied to her husband-to-be to be here. "All right," he said. "We can talk here." They walked a short distance from the wagon, far enough that the girls couldn't hear, but close enough that Lydia could keep them in sight. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself despite the heat, and for a moment she just looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I didn't know you were here," she said finally. "In Kansas, in Willow Creek. I didn't know." "How could you? We lost touch 18 years ago." "I tried to find you." The words burst out like they'd been held under pressure. "After we left Missouri, I tried to write, but my father, He made sure I couldn't. He burned the first letter I wrote, then watched me like a hawk. By the time I had any freedom, we'd moved twice, and I didn't know where you were or how to reach you. Caleb's throat tightened. I looked for you too. Asked everyone, followed every lead. You'd just vanished. My father owed money to dangerous people. We had to disappear. She looked down at her hands, fingers twisted together. We went to Ohio, then Pennsylvania, then New York. He died 5 years ago, drank himself to death. My mother followed him within the year, just gave up. And my siblings scattered. I was alone. Lydia, I became a seamstress. It was honest work, but it barely kept me fed. The boarding house where I lived, the owner decided he wanted more from me than rent money. When I refused, she swallowed hard. Let's just say I needed to leave quickly. I had no savings, no family, nowhere to go. A friend showed me an advertisement from a Kansas rancher looking for a wife. Frank's advertisement. He wanted someone practical, someone who could cook and manage a household and help with his children. It seemed like an answer. Did you love him? The question came out before Caleb could stop it. In the letters, did you No. Simple, definite. I don't love Frank. I've only known him 6 days, and in those 6 days, she stopped, pressing her lips together. What? Lydia, what's happened? She looked past him, toward the prairie, and he saw her eyes shimmer with unshed tears. He's not cruel exactly, not in ways that show, but he's hard, cold. His daughters are terrified of him. They tiptoe around the house like ghosts, afraid to make noise, afraid to displease him. He has rules for everything, and if they're broken... She trailed off, then seemed to force herself to continue. He's never hit me. Never hit them, as far as I can tell. But he doesn't need to. His disapproval is enough. His silence. The way he looks at you when you failed to meet his expectations. Caleb felt anger rising in his chest, hot and sharp. Then why are you still there? Because I have nowhere else to go. The words came out raw, desperate. I have $17 to my name. No family, no connections. If I leave Frank, I'll be destitute. And the girls, Clara and Beth, they've already lost one mother. If I leave, what happens to them? You can't sacrifice yourself for... Can't I? She finally looked at him directly, and the pain in her eyes stole his breath. What choice do I have, Caleb? Tell me. Because I've spent the last 6 days trying to figure it out. And I can't see any path forward that doesn't end in disaster. He wanted to say, stay here, stay with me. I'll take care of you. I've loved you for 18 years, and I'll keep loving you for 18 more. But the words stuck in his throat, trapped behind practicality and propriety and the paralyzing fear that she didn't feel the same way. That seeing him again had been nothing but shock and nostalgia, not love. Why did you come here? He asked instead. Why risk Frank's anger to see me? Lydia's hands twisted harder together. Because I needed to know if it was real. That moment at the depot, the way you looked at me, I needed to know if I imagined it. Imagined what? That you still... She stopped, started again. That I still mattered to you. That I wasn't just a ghost from your past that you'd long since forgotten. Caleb closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders gently. She looked up at him, startled, and he saw everything he needed to see in her eyes. You've haunted me for 18 years, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Every woman I've ever known, I've compared to you. Every moment of happiness, I've wondered what it would have been like if you were there to share it. I built this ranch with my own hands, and the whole time I was thinking about how you'd wanted to be a teacher, and how maybe I could have built you a schoolhouse too, if things had been different. A tear spilled down her cheek. Caleb, seeing you on that platform was like being kicked in the chest and coming home at the same time, and watching you walk away with Frank Dalton was the second worst moment of my life. The first was the day you disappeared. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. If I'd known you were here, I never would have... I know. He forced himself to release her shoulders, to step back because touching her was dangerous. I know, Lydia, but you're here now, and you're about to marry him, and I need to know. Is that what you want, truly? The silence stretched between them, heavy with 18 years of what-ifs and might-have-beens. "No," she said finally, the word barely audible. "But it's what I have to do." From the wagon, one of the girls called out, her voice thin and frightened. "Miss Moore? Is everything all right?" Lydia turned, wiping quickly at her eyes, pasting on a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "Everything's fine, Clara. I'll be right there." When she turned back to Caleb, her expression had shifted, resignation settling over her features like a veil. "I have to go," she said. "Frank will notice if I'm gone too long." "Lydia, wait. Please don't make this harder than it already is." Her voice broke on the last word. "I came here to see you, to say goodbye properly. To tell you that seeing you again was the best and worst thing that could have happened to me. And now I need to go back and try to make the best of the life I've chosen." "You don't have to choose it," Caleb said desperately. "There are other options. There has to be." "There aren't." She was already backing away, toward the wagon, toward her duty. "I wish there were, but there aren't." She climbed back onto the wagon seat, gathered the reins, and looked at him one last time. The sun was behind him, putting her face in shadow, but he could feel the weight of her gaze like a physical thing. "If I could choose my life over again," she said quietly, "knowing everything I know now, I'd still pick that day by the creek, that kiss, that moment. It was worth all of this pain just to have had it once." Then she snapped the reins and the wagon rolled away, carrying her back toward Frank Dalton and duty and a life that didn't include room for Caleb Harlan. He stood in his yard long after she'd disappeared from view, the hammer still dangling from his hand, his heart a raw wound in his chest. The smart thing would be to let her go. But Caleb had never been particularly smart when it came to Lydia Moore. The sunset that evening painted the sky in shades of blood and fire, and Caleb sat on his porch watching it like a man waiting for judgment. The conversation with Lydia played on endless repeat in his mind, every word, every pause, every flicker of emotion across her face. The way she'd said his name, the tears she'd tried to hide, the resignation in her voice when she'd driven away. He couldn't let it end like this. The realization didn't come as a flash of insight or a sudden decision. It built slowly, inevitably, like water rising behind a dam. By the time full darkness fell, Caleb knew what he had to do, even if he didn't yet know how to do it. He couldn't let Lydia marry Frank Dalton, not when she clearly didn't want to. Not when the life waiting for her in that cabin was one of quiet misery and slow suffocation. But knowing what he wanted and knowing how to achieve it were two entirely different things. Frank Dalton was a proud man, and Lydia was bound to him by contract and necessity. Just riding up to the cabin and declaring his feelings wouldn't accomplish anything except possibly getting him shot. Frank had a reputation for settling disputes with his fists, and while Caleb could hold his own in a fight, violence wouldn't solve the real problem. The real problem was that Lydia believed she had no other options, that marrying Frank was the only path forward that didn't end in destitution. Caleb could offer her another path, could offer her his ranch, his protection, his name, could offer her everything he'd spent 18 years building if she'd have it. But would she? Or would pride and propriety keep her trapped in a decision she'd already made? Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by plans that formed and dissolved like smoke. By dawn, Caleb had made up his mind. He would give her 3 days, 3 days to settle in, to see what life with Frank would truly be like, to understand the full weight of her choice. And then he would go to her, openly and honestly, and offer her an alternative. If she refused, he'd accept it and walk away. But at least she'd know she had a choice. 3 days. He could wait 3 days. The first day passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Caleb worked his land with mechanical efficiency, his hands busy while his mind spun scenarios. What would he say? How would he approach it? What if Frank was there? What if the girls were frightened? What if Lydia had changed her mind and decided she was content after all? The second day brought unexpected company. Doc Whitmore rode up mid-morning, his medical bag slung over his saddle, his expression troubled. "Got a minute?" the old doctor asked, dismounting with a grunt. "Always got time for you, Doc. Coffee?" "That'd be welcome." They settled on the porch, cups in hand, and for a few minutes they just sat in comfortable silence. Doc had been a fixture in Caleb's life for years, had stitched up more than one injury, had offered advice, both medical and otherwise, had never judged, and never pried unless necessary. "Saw Frank Dalton's new bride in town yesterday," Doc said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "She came in with those little girls to buy fabric at the mercantile." Caleb's hands tightened on his cup. "That's so?" "She's got good instincts with children. The girls were scared at first, all those people, all that noise. But she kept them close, talked to them gentle, made it feel safe." Doc took a sip of his coffee. "Mrs. Henderson tried to engage her in conversation, asked some pointed questions about her past and how she came to marry Frank. Miss Moore handled it with grace, didn't give that old gossip anything to chew on. Good for her. But Caleb," Doc's voice shifted, took on a weight that made Caleb look up. "I watched her face when she thought no one was looking. That woman is carrying a burden heavier than fabric and thread." "What kind of burden?" "The kind that comes from making impossible choices." Doc set his cup down carefully. "I've been a doctor for 40 years. I've seen plenty of mail-order brides, plenty of marriages of convenience, plenty of women who had to settle for less than they deserved. And I've learned to recognize the difference between resignation and despair. Miss Moore is closer to despair than I'm comfortable with." Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. "Has Frank hurt her?" "Not physically, as far as I can tell. But there are other ways to hurt someone. Frank's a hard man who's gotten harder since his wife died. He's rigid, unforgiving, and he expects perfection from everyone around him. That's a heavy burden for anyone, but especially for a woman who's already running from something and trying to start over." "Why are you telling me this?" Doc met his eyes squarely. "Because you care about her. Because she clearly knows you from before. And because sometimes when someone's drowning, they need someone to throw them a rope before it's too late." "She made her choice, Doc. Did she? Or did circumstances make it for her?" The old man stood, collecting his cup. "I'm not telling you to do anything foolish, Caleb. I'm just saying that sometimes the right thing and the foolish thing are the same thing, and a man has to decide which matters more, propriety or conscience." He left shortly after, riding back toward town with a wave, leaving Caleb alone with thoughts that had grown teeth. The second day bled into the third, and Caleb's resolve hardened into something unshakable. Tomorrow. Tomorrow he would ride to Frank's cabin and speak his piece. Tomorrow he would offer Lydia a choice, consequences be damned. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. It was well past midnight when Caleb was jolted awake by the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. He grabbed his rifle by instinct, moving to the window, and saw a horse thundering up his path. Rider hunched low in the saddle. His heart kicked hard. Something was wrong. He threw open the door just as the rider pulled up, and in the moonlight he recognized the horse, Frank Dalton's bay mare, but not the rider. It was Clara, Frank's oldest daughter, her face streaked with tears and terror. "Mr. Harlan," she gasped, sliding off the horse with desperate clumsiness. "Please, you have to come. You have to help." Caleb was down the steps in an instant, catching her before she fell. "Clara, what happened? Where's your father?" "He's drunk. He came home drunk and angry, and he's—" She sobbed, words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "He's yelling at Miss Moore, and she told me to run, to go get help. And I remembered Beth said this was where Miss Moore came before, and—" "Slow down." Caleb crouched to her level, hands gentle on her shoulders. "Your father is drunk and yelling at Miss Moore. Is he hurting her?" "I don't know. He was throwing things, and she was crying, and she pushed me out the door and said to get help. And I ran to the barn and took the horse. You did good, Clara. You did exactly right." Caleb was already moving, his mind racing ahead. "Where's Beth?" "Hiding under her bed. She's scared to come out." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Stay here. My door locks from the inside. There's food in the kitchen and blankets in the chest. Don't open the door for anyone but me, understand?" "You're going to help her? You're going to help Miss Moore?" "I'm going to help her." He was already saddling his horse, movements swift and sure. "I promise, Clara. I'll bring her back safe." The ride to Frank's cabin took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Caleb pushed his horse hard, the moonlight bright enough to see by, his mind filled with images of what he might find. If Frank had hurt Lydia, if he'd laid one hand on her. The cabin came into view, and Caleb could see lamplight in the windows, could hear shouting even from a distance. He dismounted at a run, hitting the door with his shoulder. It wasn't locked. The door flew open, and the scene inside stopped Caleb's heart. Frank Dalton stood in the center of the room, swaying on his feet, a whiskey bottle in one hand. The table was overturned, dishes smashed on the floor, and backed into the corner, her face pale and frightened, was Lydia. She had a red mark on her cheek that was already darkening to a bruise. "Get out!" Frank roared when he saw Caleb. "This is my house, my business!" "Your business became mine when you put your hands on her." Caleb's voice was deadly calm, but inside he was pure fury. "Step away from her, Frank. Now. She's my wife. She's not your wife. You haven't married yet." Caleb moved into the room slowly, positioning himself between Frank and Lydia. "And even if you had, that wouldn't give you the right to hit her." Frank's face twisted with drunken rage. "She disrespected me, questioned my authority, in my own house." "I asked him not to lock Beth in the cellar," Lydia said, her voice shaking but defiant. "She's 5 years old and terrified of the dark. He wanted to punish her for spilling milk at supper." Caleb felt his control slip another notch. "You were going to lock a 5-year-old in a cellar? In the dark?" "My house, my rules!" Frank lunged forward, swinging the bottle. Caleb was faster. He caught Frank's wrist, twisted, and the bottle fell to the floor with a crash. Frank swung with his other fist, but drunk and unbalanced, the punch went wide. Caleb shoved him backward, and Frank stumbled, falling hard against the wall. "Stay down," Caleb warned. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will if you make me." Frank struggled to his feet, murder in his eyes. And Caleb realized this wasn't going to end with words. He planted his feet, ready, and when Frank charged, he met him head-on. The fight was brief and brutal. Frank had rage on his side, but Caleb had sobriety and skill. 3 punches later, Frank was on the floor, blood streaming from his nose, groaning. Caleb stood over him, breathing hard, knuckles screaming. "You done?" Frank spat blood. "Get out of my house." "Gladly, but Lydia's coming with me." "Like hell she is." "Look at me, Frank." Caleb waited until the other man's bleary eyes focused. "Look at what you've become. Your wife died and you turned into someone who terrorizes children and hits women. Clara ran to me for help. Your own daughter was so scared of you that she stole your horse and rode 2 hours in the dark to find help. That tell you anything?" Something flickered across Frank's face. Shame, maybe, or the distant echo of the man he'd once been. But it was quickly swallowed by stubborn pride. "You can't take her. She signed a contract." "I can and I will. You can try to enforce that contract, but everyone in town saw the bruise you put on her face. Judge Morrison won't look kindly on that." Caleb moved to Lydia, who was still pressed against the wall, eyes wide with shock. "Lydia, where's Beth?" "In her room, under the bed." "Can you get her? We're leaving." She looked at Frank, then back at Caleb. "Where will we go?" "My place. It's not much, but it's safe, and Clara's already there waiting for you." Something shifted in her expression, fear giving way to fragile hope. She nodded once, then moved quickly toward the back room. Caleb kept his eyes on Frank, who was pulling himself up to sit against the wall, hand pressed to his bleeding nose. "This isn't over," Frank said. "Yeah, it is. You want to come after us, you go ahead and try. But know this, I won't let you near them again. Any of them." Lydia emerged moments later carrying Beth, the little girl's face buried in her shoulder, small body trembling. Lydia's eyes met Caleb's, and in them he saw terror and gratitude and something else he couldn't quite name. "Let's go," he said gently. They walked out of that cabin into the cool night air, leaving Frank bleeding and alone in the wreckage of his own making. Caleb helped Lydia onto his horse, then mounted behind her, keeping Beth secure between them. The ride back was silent except for Beth's occasional whimpers and Lydia's soft reassurances. When they reached Caleb's ranch, Clara was waiting on the porch, and when she saw them, she burst into tears of relief. Lydia slid down with Beth still in her arms, and Clara ran to them, wrapping her arms around them both. "You're safe," Clara sobbed. "You're all safe." "Thanks to you," Lydia said, her own tears flowing freely now. "You were so brave, Clara. So incredibly brave." Caleb watched them from his saddle. These three people who'd been strangers to each other a week ago, now clinging together like family. His heart felt too large for his chest. He dismounted and led his horse to the barn, giving them a moment of privacy. When he returned, Lydia had gotten both girls inside and was settling them on his bed, the only bed in the cabin. "They're exhausted," she said quietly, meeting him at the door. "Beth's already half asleep, and Clara's fighting it but losing." "Good. Let them rest." Caleb gestured to the main room. "You should too. Take the bed. I'll sleep out here." "Caleb, this is your home. I can't—" "You can, and you will. All of you." He moved to the fireplace, adding wood that didn't need adding, just to have something to do with his hands. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." She stood there for a long moment, and when he finally turned to look at her, he saw that she was studying him with an expression he couldn't read. "You came for me," she said. "When Clara showed up, you didn't hesitate." "Of course I came." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with 18 years of history and 1 week of upheaval. "You know why," Caleb said quietly. She took a step toward him, then another, until she was close enough that he could see the bruise on her cheek in the lamplight. His hand rose without thought, fingertips ghosting over the mark with feather-light care. "Did he do this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes." I pushed back against him, locking Beth in the cellar, and he— She closed her eyes. "I should have been more careful. Should have known better than to contradict him when he'd been drinking." "Don't do that. Don't make excuses for him." Caleb's voice was rough. "This isn't your fault, Lydia. I knew what he was like. I knew, and I still came here, still agreed to marry him. What does that make me?" "Desperate. Afraid. Human." He cupped her face gently, making sure she met his eyes. "It makes you someone who was trying to survive the only way she knew how. That's not weakness. That's courage." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I don't feel courageous. I feel like I've made one mistake after another." "Then let me help you unmake them." The words came out before he could stop them, raw and honest. "Stay here. You and the girls. Stay with me." She stared at him, lips parted in surprise. "Caleb, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." He took a breath, then said what he'd been holding back for days. "I told you before that you've haunted me for 18 years. I wasn't exaggerating. Seeing you on that platform felt like coming back to life after being half dead. And watching you walk away to marry Frank felt like dying all over again." "Caleb, let me finish, please." He dropped his hand from her face but didn't step back. "I don't know what the future looks like. I don't know if you feel the same way I do, or if I'm just a familiar face in a frightening situation. But I know I can offer you safety. I can offer you a home. And if you'll let me, I can offer you more than that. I can offer you everything I am and everything I have. No conditions, no obligations, just a choice. A real choice." The silence that followed felt eternal. Then Lydia whispered, "I never stopped loving you." The words hit him like lightning. "What?" "When my family left Missouri, I cried for months. I wrote letter after letter that my father burned, trying to find a way back to you. And when I finally accepted that I couldn't, I tried to move on. I tried so hard." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "But every man I met, I compared to you. Every kind word, every gentle gesture. I measured it against that afternoon by the creek, against the boy who looked at me like I was something precious. And no one measured up. No one." Caleb's throat was so tight, he could barely breathe. "Then why did you agree to marry Frank?" "Because I was desperate and alone and terrified. Because I thought love was something I'd lost the right to hope for. Because I'd convinced myself that survival was enough." She reached up, her hand covering his where it rested against her cheek. "But then I stepped off that train and saw you standing there, and everything I'd been telling myself fell apart. You weren't a memory. You weren't a dream. You were real and right there and looking at me like you'd been waiting all this time." "I had been," he said hoarsely. "I've been waiting for you to come home. I'm not the girl you remember. I've been hurt and hardened, and I don't care." He pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to frame her face. "I don't care what you've been through or how you've changed. I care that you're here now. I care that you're safe. And I care that you just told me you never stopped loving me. Because, Lydia, I never stopped loving you either. Not for one single day. She made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. This is crazy. We've been apart for 18 years. We barely know each other anymore. Then we'll learn. We'll take our time and figure it out together. He brushed his thumb across her uninjured cheek, wiping away tears. Unless you don't want to, unless I'm pushing too hard or asking too much. She kissed him. It was sudden and fierce and desperate, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him down to meet her. And Caleb, who'd spent 18 years dreaming of this moment, kissed her back with everything he had. It was nothing like that first kiss by the creek. That had been sweet and uncertain, tentative exploration. This was confirmation and claim and promise all at once. This was two people who'd been lost finding their way home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lydia pressed her forehead to his chest. I want to stay, she whispered. I want to stay here with you so badly it terrifies me. Then stay. Be terrified. We'll figure it out together. What about Frank? He won't just let this go. He'll come for us. For me. And the girls, they're his daughters. He has legal rights. Let him come. Caleb's voice was steel-wrapped in gentleness. We'll deal with Frank when we have to. Right now, all that matters is that you're safe. That those girls in there are safe. Everything else we'll handle as it comes. She pulled back enough to look up at him, searching his face. You'd really take us all in? 2 children who aren't yours? A woman who comes with nothing but trouble? You come with everything I've ever wanted, he said simply. The rest is just details. She laughed then, broken and beautiful, and let him hold her while she cried out weeks of fear and desperation and loss. He held her through it all, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring reassurances, being the solid thing she could lean against. When the tears finally stopped, she was exhausted but lighter, as if something heavy had been lifted from her shoulders. You should sleep, Caleb said. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. What will we do? First thing, I'll ride to town and talk to Judge Morrison. Frank hit you, and he was going to lock a child in a cellar. That matters. Then we'll see Doc Whitmore, get that bruise looked at. After that, he shrugged. After that, we start building something new. Just like that? Just like that. He smiled, and it felt like the first genuine smile he'd worn in years. I told you, Lydia, I've been waiting 18 years. Now that I have you back, I'm not letting go without a fight. She reached up, touching his face with wonder, like she couldn't quite believe he was real. I don't deserve you. That's where you're wrong. You deserve everything good this world has to offer, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you get it. He walked her to the bedroom door, where Clara and Beth lay curled together in his bed, finally peaceful. Lydia paused in the doorway, looking back at him. Thank you, she said, for coming for me, for fighting for me, for offering me a choice when I thought I had none left. Thank me by staying, by letting me prove that this, he gestured between them, is worth whatever fight comes next. She nodded, then slipped into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Caleb stood alone in his cabin, looking at the closed door, and felt something he hadn't felt in 18 years. Hope. Outside, the night was vast and dark, and somewhere in it, Frank Dalton was nursing his wounds and his rage. Tomorrow would bring consequences and complications. Tomorrow would test every promise Caleb had just made. But tonight, Lydia was safe. Tonight, she'd chosen him. And tonight, for the first time since that summer by the creek, Caleb Harlan allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future that included her. He settled onto the floor near the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket, and closed his eyes. Sleep came easier than it had in days, and his dreams were filled with creek water and strawberries, and the sound of her voice saying, I never stopped loving you. Tomorrow would come with all its challenges. But tonight, that was enough. Dawn broke soft and golden across the prairie, light spilling through the cabin windows like liquid honey. Caleb woke to the sound of small footsteps and hushed voices. The girls were awake. He pushed himself up from his makeshift bed on the floor, muscles protesting, and found Clara standing in the doorway of the bedroom, watching him with solemn eyes. Is it safe? She whispered. Can we stay? The question broke his heart. No child should have to ask if she was safe in the morning light. You can stay as long as you need, Caleb said gently. This is your home now, if you want it to be. Clara's lower lip trembled, and she nodded once before disappearing back into the bedroom. Moments later, Lydia emerged, her hair loose around her shoulders, the bruise on her cheek dark purple in the morning sun. She looked exhausted but determined, and when her eyes found his, something warm passed between them. I should make breakfast, she said quietly. It's the least I can do. You don't owe me anything, Lydia. I know, but I'd like to, if you'll let me. They moved around the small kitchen in careful choreography, her at the stove while he fetched water and set the table. The girls emerged slowly, Beth clinging to Clara's hand, both of them looking around the cabin with wide, uncertain eyes. It was Clara who finally spoke, her voice small but brave. Mr. Harlan, will Father come looking for us? Caleb crouched down to her level, meeting her eyes with honest gravity. He might, but if he does, I won't let him hurt any of you. That's a promise. It was scary last night, Beth whispered, her first words since arriving. He threw the plate and it broke and Miss Moore got cut. Caleb's eyes snapped to Lydia, who touched her forearm self-consciously. It's just a scratch. Nothing serious. Let me see. She hesitated, then rolled up her sleeve to reveal a long, shallow cut across her inner forearm. It had been cleaned but needed proper bandaging. Caleb's jaw tightened as he imagined the moment. Frank, in a drunken rage, throwing dishes, Lydia trying to shield the children while glass shattered around them. We're seeing Doc Whitmore today, he said, his tone brooking no argument. That needs to be looked at properly, and he needs to document the bruise. Document it? Why? Because when Frank tries to claim you back, and he will, we need evidence of what he did. Judge Morrison is a fair man, but he'll need proof. Lydia's expression shifted, understanding dawning. You think this will go to court? I think Frank's pride won't let him walk away quietly. Better to be prepared. They ate breakfast in relative silence, the girls slowly relaxing as they realized no one was going to yell or punish them for small mistakes. When Beth spilled milk, she froze in terror, but Lydia simply wiped it up with a gentle smile and poured more. The relief on the child's face was palpable. After breakfast, Caleb saddled the horses while Lydia helped the girls wash and dress. The ride into town would take 2 hours, and he wanted to get there early, before word spread too far about what had happened. In a town the size of Willow Creek, gossip traveled faster than wildfire, and he had no doubt that by now, half the county knew that Frank Dalton's mail-order bride had run off with Caleb Harlan. The story they'd tell, he knew, would be scandalous. A woman leaving her intended for another man, children stolen in the night, violence and impropriety and all manner of speculation. Let them talk. Caleb had never cared much for gossip, and he wasn't about to start now. What mattered was keeping Lydia and the girls safe. Everything else was just noise. They rode out as the sun climbed higher, Caleb on his gelding with Beth seated in front of him, Lydia on Frank's mare with Clara behind her. The irony of using Frank's own horse wasn't lost on any of them, but it was practical. They'd return it to him eventually, once everything was settled. If it could be settled peacefully. Caleb had his doubts. The morning air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers. Under different circumstances, it would have been a pleasant ride. As it was, tension sat heavy on all of them. Clara kept looking back over her shoulder as if expecting to see her father charging after them. Beth was silent, her small body rigid with barely contained fear. And Lydia rode with her spine straight and her chin up, but Caleb could see the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands gripped the reins just a little too hard. Tell me about your ranch, Lydia said after a while, clearly trying to ease the tension. How long have you had it? Built it from nothing about 10 years ago, Caleb said, grateful for the distraction. Bought the land cheap because nobody wanted it. Too far from town, soil was rough. Spent 5 years just breaking ground and building the cabin. Started with 20 head of cattle. Now I've got near 100. You did all that yourself? Mostly. Had help from neighbors during barn raising, and I hired hands for roundup seasons, but yeah, most of it was just me and stubbornness. It's a good place, Clara said quietly. It feels quiet. In a good way. Caleb glanced back at her and smiled. Yeah, it is quiet. Sometimes too quiet, if I'm being honest. Be nice to have it feel more like a home. He caught Lydia's eye as he said it, and the small smile she gave him made his chest tighten with hope. They reached Willow Creek just before midday. The town was busier than usual. Market day brought folks in from surrounding farms, and Main Street bustled with activity. Caleb felt the weight of stairs as they rode through, felt the whispers following them like shadows. He kept his expression neutral, his posture relaxed, silently daring anyone to say something to his face. No one did. Cowards, the lot of them, willing to gossip but not to confront. They stopped first at Doc Whitmore's office, a tidy building on the edge of town with a painted sign swinging in the breeze. The old doctor was seeing a patient when they arrived, but his assistant, a capable young woman named Sarah, took one look at Lydia's bruised face and ushered them inside immediately. Doc emerged from the examination room minutes later, took in the scene with shrewd eyes, and nodded once. "Back room, all of you." He examined Lydia first, documenting the bruise with clinical precision, cleaning and bandaging the cut on her arm. Then he looked at the girls, checking them for injuries with gentle thoroughness. Clara had bruises on her upper arms, finger marks, from where Frank had grabbed her. Beth had a healing burn on her hand that she claimed came from accidentally touching the stove, but the placement was suspicious. Doc said nothing during the examination, but his expression grew darker with each discovery. When he was finished, he washed his hands and turned to Caleb with grim determination. "I'll write up a full report for Judge Morrison. This," he gestured to Lydia's bruise, "is assault, plain and simple. The girls show signs of rough handling and possible neglect. If Frank tries to claim them back, this will matter." "Thank you, Doc." "Don't thank me yet. Frank's got legal standing as their father, and Miss Moore here technically signed a marriage contract with him. This isn't going to be simple." "I know," Caleb said, "but it's the right thing to do." Doc studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, it is. For what it's worth, I'm glad you got them out of there. That cabin was becoming a place of fear, and fear is poison to children." They left the doctor's office and headed straight for the courthouse, a stolid brick building that housed both the judge's chambers and the town records. Judge Morrison was in, thankfully, and agreed to see them immediately when his clerk mentioned the nature of the visit. The judge was a weathered man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness tempered with pragmatism. He listened to Caleb's account without interruption, then asked Lydia to tell her version of events. She did, her voice steady despite obvious nervousness, recounting Frank's drinking, his treatment of the girls, the violence of the previous night. When she finished, Judge Morrison sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Miss Moore, you signed a marriage contract with Frank Dalton, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you came here of your own free will, understanding that you were agreeing to marry him?" "I did." "So legally speaking, you're bound to fulfill that contract unless you can demonstrate just cause for breaking it." The judge's tone wasn't unkind, just stating facts. Physical violence would certainly qualify as just cause, and Doc's report will help establish that. However, Frank is the legal father of those girls, and unless we can prove he's unfit, he has rights to them. "He locked Beth in a cellar," Lydia said, her voice shaking with controlled anger. "She's 5 years old. He locked her in the dark as punishment for spilling milk." The judge's expression darkened. "He did he? You witnessed this?" "I stopped him before he could actually do it. That's when he hit me." "And the girl, Clara, she can corroborate this?" Clara, who'd been sitting quietly beside Lydia, spoke up with surprising firmness. "Yes, sir. Father's been getting meaner since Mother died. He yells a lot and he hurts us sometimes. Not bad enough to leave marks usually, but it hurts. And he gets really scary when he drinks." Judge Morrison looked at the child with something like sorrow in his eyes. "I'm sorry you've had to live with that, young lady. No child should be afraid in their own home." He turned his attention back to Caleb. "What's your intention here, Harlan? You planning to marry Miss Moore yourself?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. Caleb felt Lydia's eyes on him, felt the weight of the moment. "If she'll have me, yes. But first and foremost, I intend to provide her and these girls with a safe home. Marriage can come later, when things have settled and she's had time to make a clear choice without fear clouding her judgment." The judge raised an eyebrow. "That's remarkably sensible of you. Most men would be pushing for a quick wedding to legitimize the situation." "I'm not most men. And Lydia deserves better than being traded from one hasty marriage to another. Judge Morrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, here's what I can do. Based on Doc's report and the testimony I've heard, I'm issuing a temporary protective order. Frank Dalton is not to approach Miss Moore or his daughters without court supervision until we can hold a full hearing. That hearing will take place in 1 week's time, and Frank will have the opportunity to present his side of things. In the meantime, Miss Moore, you're free to stay wherever you choose, and the girls will remain in your care. Thank you, Your Honor, Lydia breathed. Don't thank me yet. This is just temporary. If Frank can convince me he's sober and remorseful and willing to change, I might have to return the girls to him. They are his children, after all, and the law favors blood relations. Even if they're terrified of him? Caleb's voice was hard. Even then, unless we can prove ongoing danger. One night of drunken violence, while serious, might not be enough if Frank can demonstrate it was an isolated incident. The judge's expression was sympathetic but firm. I know that's not what you want to hear, but that's the reality of the law. They left the courthouse with the protective order in hand, but the victory felt hollow. 1 week. They had 1 week before Frank would have his chance to take back what he believed was his. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, everyone lost in their own thoughts. Clara and Beth had relaxed somewhat after seeing the doctor and judge, but the shadow of uncertainty hung over all of them. Lydia rode with her shoulders tight, and Caleb could practically see her mind working, trying to plan for every possible outcome. It was late afternoon when they finally reached the ranch. Caleb helped everyone dismount, then set about tending to the horses while Lydia took the girls inside. By the time he joined them, she had somehow managed to make the cabin feel more like a home. She'd straightened things, found wildflowers to put in a jar on the table, and was starting preparations for supper. You don't have to do all this, Caleb said from the doorway. She looked up, a slight smile on her face despite the exhaustion in her eyes. I know. But it helps. Keeping busy helps. He understood that. After his own world had fallen apart 18 years ago, work had been his salvation too. The evening passed in domestic simplicity. They ate together, the girls slowly coming out of their shells as they realized no one was going to criticize or punish them. After supper, Caleb taught them a card game his uncle had taught him, and for an hour they were just people in a cabin, laughing at bad hands and teasing each other about strategy. When the girls finally went to bed, Caleb and Lydia found themselves alone on the porch, watching the stars emerge like scattered diamonds across the velvet sky. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, Lydia said quietly. This all feels too good to be real, too easy, despite everything. It's not easy, Caleb said. We're just taking it one moment at a time. What if Frank wins the hearing? What if the judge makes me give the girls back to him? Then we figure out another way. We don't give up, Lydia. That's not who we are. She turned to look at him, her face pale in the moonlight. Why are you doing this? Really? We haven't seen each other in 18 years. You don't owe me anything. I'm not doing it because I owe you. I'm doing it because... He struggled to find the right words. Because when I saw you on that platform, everything I'd convinced myself I'd gotten over came rushing back, and I realized I'd spent 18 years building a life that was missing the most important piece. You. Caleb, I love you, he said simply. I loved you when we were kids, and I love you now. Maybe that's crazy. Maybe it makes no sense. But it's true. Tears shimmered in her eyes. I love you too. I told you that last night, but I need to say it again. I love you, Caleb. I think I've loved you every day for 18 years, even when I was trying not to. He reached for her hand and she let him take it, their fingers intertwining like they'd been made to fit together. Whatever happens at that hearing, he said, whatever the judge decides, we face it together. All of us. You're not alone anymore. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, and they sat like that for a long time, taking comfort in simple presence and shared warmth. The days that followed settled into a cautious routine. Caleb worked the ranch while Lydia tended the cabin and the girls, all of them existing in a bubble of temporary peace. But underneath the surface, tension built like a gathering storm. The hearing loomed, and with it the possibility that everything could be torn apart. On the 5th day, Frank Dalton made his presence known. Caleb was mending fence in the south pasture when he saw a rider approaching. He recognized Frank immediately. The rigid posture, the aggressive way he spurred his horse. Caleb set down his tools and walked to meet him, keeping himself between Frank and the cabin. Frank pulled up 20 feet away, his face hard and cold. The bruising Caleb had given him was fading to yellow and green, but it was still visible. So was the rage in his eyes. "You got some nerve," Frank said without preamble, "stealing my bride and my children." "I didn't steal anyone. Lydia made a choice, and I'm respecting it. She's under contract to me. She owes me a wedding. Kim, she owes you nothing. You hit her, Frank. You were going to lock a 5-year-old in a cellar. Whatever claim you think you had, you gave up when you raised your hand to her." Frank's jaw worked, fury and shame warring on his face. "I was drunk. It was a mistake." Being drunk doesn't excuse violence. It just reveals what's already inside. "Those are my daughters," Frank said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "Mine, and the judge will give them back to me. Their blood." "Blood doesn't mean anything if it comes with fear. Those girls are safe with Lydia. They're happy. When's the last time you could say that about them being with you?" Something flickered across Frank's expression. Pain, perhaps, or the ghost of the father he used to be. But it was quickly buried under stubborn pride. "I want to see them. I have a right to see my own children. The judge said no contact without supervision. You know that. They're mine." The words came out as a roar, and Frank's horse danced nervously beneath him. "You have no right to keep them from me." "I have every right when you're a danger to them." Caleb kept his voice level, refusing to be provoked. "If you want to see them, do it properly. Through the court. Show Judge Morrison you can be sober and responsible. Show him you can be the father they need instead of the one they're afraid of." "I don't need lectures from you, Harlan. You who never had children of your own. You who's been alone so long you've forgotten what family even means." The words were meant to wound, and they did. But Caleb didn't let it show. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been alone. But now I'm not. And I'll be damned if I let you destroy what we're building here because your pride can't handle the fact that your daughters feel safer with strangers than they do with you." Frank stared at him, jaw clenched, hands fisting on the reins. For a moment, Caleb thought he might dismount, might try to force his way past. But then Frank seemed to deflate slightly, the fight draining out of him. "The hearing's in 2 days," he said flatly. "We'll see what the judge says then." "Yeah, we will." Frank wheeled his horse around and rode off without another word, leaving Caleb standing in the prairie grass with his heart pounding and his hands shaking with suppressed adrenaline. When he returned to the cabin, Lydia was waiting on the porch, her face pale. "I saw him," she said. "What did he want?" "To warn me. To stake his claim." Caleb climbed the steps and pulled her into his arms, needing the contact as much as offering it. "He's not going to make this easy." "I'm scared, Caleb. What if the judge sides with him? What if—" "Then we'll figure it out. We'll appeal. We'll find another way. I'm not letting him take you or those girls. I promise you that." She clung to him, and he held her while the sun tracked across the sky and the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the scent of coming rain and the weight of uncertain futures. That night, after the girls were asleep, Caleb and Lydia sat at the table with coffee growing cold between them, trying to prepare for every possible outcome of the hearing. "If he gets the girls back," Lydia said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'll go with them. I can't leave them with him alone." "Lydia, no. If you go back to him, I'll be careful. I'll be what he wants, say what he wants to hear. I'll protect them the only way I can." Caleb reached across the table and gripped her hand. "That's not protecting them. That's sacrificing yourself. There has to be another way." "What way? If the judge rules against us, we're out of options." "No, we're not." An idea was forming in Caleb's mind, desperate and wild, but possibly workable. "If it comes to that, if the judge is going to rule in Frank's favor, I'll speak up. I'll offer to adopt the girls." Lydia stared at him. "You can't be serious." "Why not?" "Frank clearly can't care for them properly. If I petition for custody, show that I can provide a stable home. You're a single man. The law favors blood relatives over strangers, even unmarried ones." "Then we get married." The words came out before he could second guess them. Before the hearing. We get married, and then we petition together. A married couple with means and a safe home versus a violent drunk who can't control his temper. That changes the equation. Lydia's eyes were wide with shock. Caleb, you can't propose marriage as a legal strategy. I'm not. I'm proposing because I love you and want to spend my life with you. The timing is just convenient. She laughed, the sound caught between tears and disbelief. That's possibly the least romantic proposal in history. Yeah, probably. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. So let me try again. Lydia Moore, I've loved you since I was 18 years old. I've spent 18 years trying to forget you and failing every single day. Now that I have you back, I'm not willing to lose you again. Will you marry me? Not because it's practical or strategic, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Tears streamed down her face. Yes, Caleb, I'll marry you. He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, they were both smiling despite the fear and uncertainty that still surrounded them. We'll need to move fast, Caleb said. The hearing's in 2 days. Can we get married before then? Judge Morrison can perform the ceremony. If we go tomorrow, then tomorrow it is. He stood, pulling her up with him. Tomorrow we get married. And then, no matter what happens at that hearing, Frank will have to contend with both of us, together. She wrapped her arms around him, holding tight. I'm still scared. So am I. But we'll face it together. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while the night deepened around them, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, promising the storm that was yet to come. Morning came with the kind of clarity that follows life-changing decisions. Caleb woke before dawn, his mind already racing through everything that needed to happen. Today they would marry. Tomorrow they would face Frank in court. And after that, if fate was kind, they would begin building the life they should have had 18 years ago. He found Lydia already awake, sitting at the table with a cup of tea, staring out the window at the lightening sky. She'd pulled her hair back simply, and in the pale pre-dawn light she looked impossibly young and impossibly tired at the same time. Couldn't sleep? He asked softly. She shook her head. Too much going through my mind. Caleb, are you sure about this? Getting married so quickly? Taking on not just me, but 2 children who aren't yours? Stop. He sat beside her, covering her hand with his. Those girls might not be mine by blood, but they're already mine in every way that matters. And you? He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. You've been mine since that afternoon by the creek. This isn't quick. This is 18 years overdue. A small smile touched her lips. When you put it that way, how do we tell the girls? Honestly, I suppose. Lydia glanced toward the bedroom where Clara and Beth still slept. They're smart. They know something's happening. Better to include them than let them imagine the worst. Clara and Beth emerged an hour later to find breakfast waiting and both adults sitting at the table with nervous energy practically radiating from them. Clara's eyes went immediately suspicious, the look of a child who'd learned to anticipate bad news. What's wrong? She asked, pulling Beth close protectively. Nothing's wrong, Lydia said gently. In fact, something's right. But we need to talk to you both about it. They sat, Beth climbing into Lydia's lap while Clara maintained careful distance, still wary. Caleb let Lydia take the lead, watching her navigate the explanation with grace. You know that tomorrow we have to go back to the courthouse, Lydia began. The judge is going to decide where you girls will live, and whether your father— She paused, choosing her words carefully. Whether the situation we're in now can continue. We don't want to go back to father, Clara said, her voice small but firm. He's mean when he drinks, and he's always drinking now. I know, sweetheart, and Mr. Harlan and I are going to do everything we can to make sure you stay safe. But there's something that might help our case in court, and we wanted to ask you both how you'd feel about it. Beth looked up at Lydia with wide eyes. What is it? Mr. Harlan has asked me to marry him, and I've said yes. Silence fell over the table. Claire's face went through several expressions, surprise, confusion, then something that might have been hope. You're going to marry Mr. Harlan instead of father? Claire asked carefully. Yes, Today, actually, if we can arrange it. Does that mean we get to stay here? Beth's voice was barely a whisper. At Mr. Harlan's ranch? Caleb spoke for the first time. If the judge allows it, yes. And even if he doesn't right away, we'll keep fighting until we can all be together properly. But I want you both to understand something. He waited until both girls were looking at him. If your father gets custody of you, that doesn't mean we're giving up. We'll visit as often as the law allows. We'll make sure you're safe. And when you're old enough to choose for yourselves, our door will always be open. But we want to stay now, Clara said, tears welling in her eyes. We want to stay with you and Miss Moore. You're nice to us. You don't yell. You let us make mistakes without getting angry. Lydia pulled Clara into the embrace as well, holding both girls close. We want that too, more than anything. That's why we're getting married. Not just because we love each other, but because it gives us the best chance to keep our family together. Are we your family? Beth asked, her voice muffled against Lydia's shoulder. Yes, Caleb said firmly. Yes, you are. They finished breakfast in a strange mood, part nervous anticipation, part fragile hope. Then Caleb hitched the wagon while Lydia helped the girls dress in their cleanest clothes. They might be getting married hastily and with little fanfare, but they would do it properly, with witnesses and the full weight of the law behind them. The ride to town felt different than it had 2 days ago. Then they'd been running towards safety. Now they were running towards something else entirely. Commitment, permanence, a future they were choosing together. Clara and Beth sat in the back of the wagon, holding hands, while Lydia sat beside Caleb on the bench seat, her shoulder touching his, her hand resting lightly on his thigh. Nervous? He asked quietly. Terrified, she admitted. But in a good way. Mostly. Me too. They reached Willow Creek mid-morning to find the town bustling with its usual weekday activity. Caleb drove straight to the courthouse, where Judge Morrison was already in his chambers reviewing case files. His clerk initially tried to turn them away, but when Caleb explained their purpose, the man's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. You want to get married? Today? Before the hearing tomorrow? Yes, sir. That's rather convenient timing, Mr. Harlan. It's the right timing, Caleb corrected. Whether there was a hearing or not, I'd want to marry her. The hearing just makes it more urgent. The clerk disappeared into the judge's chambers. Long minutes passed. Then Judge Morrison himself appeared, his expression unreadable. Come in, all of you. They filed into the chambers, Caleb and Lydia, with Clara and Beth trailing nervously behind. The judge settled behind his massive oak desk and studied them with shrewd eyes. I'm going to be frank with you, he said. This looks like a strategic marriage designed to strengthen your custody claim. It is that, Caleb agreed, but it's also something we both want. Have wanted, if I'm being honest, for a very long time. Is that so, Miss Moore? Lydia met the judge's gaze steadily. Caleb and I knew each other years ago, Your Honor. We were very young, and circumstances separated us. Seeing him again was unexpected, but the feelings— She paused, gathering courage. The feelings never went away. For either of us. So yes, this is strategic timing, but it's not a false marriage. It's one I would choose regardless of the legal situation. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. And you understand that marrying him doesn't guarantee you'll be awarded custody of those girls? Frank is still their biological father, and that carries significant legal weight. I understand. But it changes the equation. A married couple with means and a stable home versus a single man with a drinking problem and a violent temper. That has to count for something. It does, the judge admitted. More than you might think. He was quiet for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. All right. I'll perform the ceremony, but I'm doing it on the record, and I'll be asking you both pointed questions to ensure this isn't a sham. If I think you're lying to me, the marriage won't happen, and your custody claim tomorrow will be severely damaged. Understood? Understood, they said in unison. The ceremony took place in the judge's chambers with his clerk and secretary serving as witnesses. Judge Morrison had them stand before his desk while Clara and Beth watched with solemn, wide eyes. There was no music, no flowers, no celebration. Just two people and the words that would bind them together in the eyes of the law. Caleb Harlan, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death parts you? Caleb looked at Lydia, seeing not just the woman before him, but the girl she'd been, the summer they'd shared, the 18 years they'd lost. He saw their future stretching ahead, uncertain, yes, but filled with possibility. I do. Lydia Moore, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death parts you? Lydia's eyes shimmered with tears, but her voice was steady. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the state of Kansas, I pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Harlan, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle, almost chaste, but it carried the weight of everything they'd been through and everything still to come. When they broke apart, Clara was crying quietly, and Beth was smiling, the first real smile Caleb had seen from her. Judge Morrison produced the marriage certificate with efficient speed, had them sign it along with the witnesses, then handed it to Caleb with an expression that was almost kind. Tomorrow's hearing just got considerably more interesting, he said. Frank's going to be furious. Let him be, Caleb said, tucking the certificate carefully into his jacket. We're doing this properly, legally. There's nothing he can say about that. No, but he can fight harder. Be prepared for that. The judge's eyes moved to Lydia. Mrs. Harlan, Frank's going to paint you as fickle, as a woman who breaks her word and runs from commitment. He's going to try to make you look unstable. I'm prepared for that, Lydia said quietly. I know what I did looks bad from the outside, but I also know that leaving him was the right choice, for me and for those girls. Then hold on to that certainty tomorrow. You're going to need it. They left the courthouse as husband and wife, the marriage certificate burning like a promise in Caleb's pocket. The girls were jubilant, chattering about the ceremony, asking when they should call Lydia mother, and if this meant they really could stay. Caleb and Lydia exchanged glances over their heads, both thinking the same thing. Don't promise what you can't guarantee. Not yet. On impulse, Caleb stopped the wagon at the mercantile. Wait here, he told them, then disappeared inside. He emerged 10 minutes later with a small package wrapped in brown paper. What's that? Lydia asked. You'll see when we get home. The ride back to the ranch passed in a blur of conversation and nervous laughter. The girls sang songs Lydia taught them, simple melodies about meadowlarks and prairie flowers. Caleb drove with one hand, the other resting on Lydia's knee, marveling at the simple fact that he could do that now. She was his wife. The words felt strange and wonderful in his mind. They reached the ranch as afternoon sun turned everything golden. Caleb helped everyone down from the wagon, then handed Lydia the package. What is this? Wedding present. Open it. Inside was a length of blue ribbon, the color of a summer sky, and a simple gold band. Lydia stared at the ring, her breath catching. Caleb, you didn't have to eat it. I know the ceremony wasn't much. No fancy dress, no celebration, but I wanted you to have something to mark it. Something that shows you're mine and I'm yours. He took the ring from the package and held it up. I know it's simple, but it's perfect. She held out her left hand and he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, gleaming in the afternoon light. Absolutely perfect. He kissed her then, properly this time, without an audience of judge and clerk. Kissed her the way he'd wanted to since seeing her on that platform. When they broke apart, both girls were giggling behind their hands. Can I help make supper? Clara asked. As a celebration? Yes, Lydia said, smiling through tears. Yes, let's make this a celebration, even if it's just us. The evening that followed was one of the happiest of Caleb's life. They cooked together, all four of them crammed into the small kitchen, laughing when Beth spilled flour and Clara burned the biscuits. They ate at the table Caleb had built himself, sharing a meal that was simple but felt like a feast. After supper, they played cards again, and this time when Beth won, she crowed with delight instead of fear. As darkness fell, Lydia took the girls to bed, reading to them from a book Caleb had on his shelf, worn and well-loved, one of the few luxuries he allowed himself. He stood in the doorway watching, seeing his cabin transformed by their presence from a place to sleep into an actual home. When both girls were finally asleep, Lydia joined him on the porch where he'd been waiting, watching the stars emerge. She carried the blue ribbon he'd bought, running it through her fingers. What's this for? She asked. Your hair. I remember you used to wear ribbons. Thought you might like one now. She turned to him, her expression soft. You remembered that? After all this time. I remember everything about you. The ribbons, the way you hummed while you worked, the sound of your laugh, the smell of honeysuckle in your hair. He reached out, tucking a loose strand behind her ear. I remember it all, Lydia. Every moment. She kissed him then, and unlike the chaste kiss in the judge's chambers, this one held heat and promise. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed. We're married now, she said, almost wonderingly. Actually married. We are. He drew her close, wrapping his arms around her. How does it feel? Right, terrifying, but right. She rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Caleb, what if tomorrow doesn't go our way? What if Frank wins? Then we appeal, we fight, we don't give up. You keep saying that, but what if there's no winning? What if the law simply isn't on our side? He was quiet for a moment, considering. Then we figure out another way. Maybe we move somewhere the law is different. Maybe we wait until the girls are old enough to choose. Maybe... He stopped, shaking his head. I don't know all the answers, Lydia, but I know I'm not letting Frank hurt any of you again, whatever that takes. She pulled back enough to look up at him. I've never had anyone fight for me before. Not like this. Get used to it. I intend to fight for you every day for the rest of our lives. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms under the vast prairie sky. Tomorrow would bring the hearing, would bring Frank's anger and legal arguments and uncertain outcomes. But tonight they were together, married, building something fragile but real. Eventually they went inside, and Caleb insisted Lydia take the bed. You need real rest for tomorrow. I'll sleep out here like I have been. Caleb, we're married now. You don't have to... I know I don't have to, but you've been through enough upheaval. I want you to feel safe, not pressured. He smiled gently. We have time, Lydia. All the time in the world. There's no rush. The gratitude in her eyes told him he'd said the right thing. She kissed him goodnight and disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Caleb settled onto his makeshift bed by the fireplace, but sleep was a long time coming. His mind kept spinning through scenarios for tomorrow, what Frank might say, what arguments Judge Morrison might accept, what evidence they'd need to present. He told Lydia not to worry, but the truth was he was terrified. Not for himself, but for her and those girls. Somewhere in the small hours of the morning, he finally drifted off, dreaming of creek water and ribbons and a future that felt simultaneously within reach and impossibly far away. Dawn came too quickly. Caleb woke to find Lydia already up, making breakfast with trembling hands. The girls were subdued, sensing the tension. They ate in near silence, everyone knowing what the day would bring. The ride to town felt like marching toward battle. Caleb drove with grim determination, Lydia beside him with the marriage certificate tucked carefully in her bag, the girls in back holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. The courthouse was already busy when they arrived. Frank's wagon was there, and Caleb felt Lydia tense beside him. They'd known this confrontation was coming, but that didn't make it easier. They entered the courthouse to find Frank waiting in the hallway with a lawyer, Thomas Brennan, a sharp-faced man known for taking difficult cases. Frank's expression when he saw them was thunderous, but it was nothing compared to his reaction when he noticed the gold band on Lydia's finger. You married him? The words came out as a snarl. You've known him for what, a week? And you married him? I've known him longer than I knew you when I agreed to marry you, Lydia said, her voice steady despite obvious fear. And he's never laid a hand on me in anger. You broke our contract. You owe me. I owe you nothing. You hit me, Frank. You terrorized your own children. Any contract between us ended the moment you raised your fist. Frank lunged forward, and Caleb stepped between them instantly, his hand on Frank's chest stopping him cold. Don't, Caleb said quietly. Don't make this worse than it already is. Gentlemen, ladies, please. Judge Morrison had appeared in the doorway of his chambers, his expression stern. This is a courthouse, not a saloon. If you can't maintain civility, I'll hold you all in contempt. Now, inside. All of you. The hearing room was small and formal, with benches for observers and a table for each party. Frank and his lawyer took one side, Caleb and Lydia the other. Clara and Beth sat on a bench behind them, Doc Whitmore beside them, offering quiet reassurance. Judge Morrison called the proceeding to order with measured formality. We're here to determine custody of Clara and Beth Dalton, and to address the matter of the broken marriage contract between Frank Dalton and Lydia Moore. He paused, correcting himself. Pardon me, Lydia Harlan. As I understand it, Miss Moore married Mr. Harlan yesterday in my chambers. That's correct, Your Honor, Caleb said. Very well. Mr. Brennan, you may present your client's case. Frank's lawyer stood, smoothing his jacket. Your Honor, my client is the biological father of Clara and Beth Dalton. He has cared for them since birth, provided for them, and maintains legal custody under the law. While it's true that an unfortunate incident occurred recently, an incident my client deeply regrets and attributes to temporary lapse in judgment, this does not negate his fundamental rights as their father. The incident being that he struck Miss Moore, Mrs. Harlan, and was physically rough with his daughters. A single evening of poor choices, Your Honor, brought on by stress and grief over the loss of his first wife. Mr. Dalton has since pledged sobriety and has agreed to attend regular meetings with Reverend Thomas to work through his anger. Judge Morrison's expression was skeptical. And Mrs. Harlan, what about the breach of contract? My client invested considerable time and money in bringing Mrs. Harlan here under the expectation of marriage. She accepted his proposal, signed the contract, and then reneged within a week, taking his children in the process. He's entitled to compensation at minimum and possibly to compel fulfillment of the contract. You can't compel someone to marry against their will, Judge Morrison said dryly. That went out with the last century, but continue. Brennan laid out Frank's case with practiced efficiency, painting him as a bereaved widower struggling to cope, a father who made one mistake but was fundamentally fit, a man wronged by a woman who'd broken her word. He made Lydia sound flighty and opportunistic, someone who'd abandoned her commitment the moment a better option appeared. When he finished, Judge Morrison turned to Caleb. Mr. Harlan, you don't have legal representation. Are you prepared to argue your own case? I am, Your Honor. Then proceed. Caleb stood, his heart hammering but his voice steady. Your Honor, the facts are simple. Frank Dalton hit Lydia in front of his children. He was going to lock a 5-year-old in a cellar as punishment for spilling milk. When his oldest daughter ran for help, she didn't go to neighbors or friends. She came to me, a man she barely knew, because she was that desperate. That tells you everything you need to know about the environment Frank created in that house. My client acknowledges his mistake, Brennan began. Let Mr. Harlan finish, Judge Morrison said. Caleb continued. Dr. Whitmore's report shows bruises on Clara's arms consistent with being grabbed roughly. Beth had a burn on her hand that Frank claimed was accidental, but the location is suspicious. These children are afraid, Your Honor. Beth barely speaks. Clara has nightmares. In the week they've been with us, they've started to relax, started to smile, started to act like children should act. But you're not their father, Brennan interjected. You have no legal standing. I'm married to the woman they've bonded with, the woman who's shown them more maternal care in 1 week than they've had in 2 years. That gives me standing. Judge Morrison held up a hand. Mrs. Harlan, I'd like to hear from you directly. Why did you marry Mr. Harlan so quickly? And please be honest. This court values truth above all else. Lydia stood, her hands clasped in front of her. Your Honor, Caleb and I knew each other 18 years ago. We were young and in love, and circumstances separated us. When I saw him at the depot, everything I'd felt came rushing back, but I didn't act on it. I went with Frank because I'd made a commitment. Then why leave? Because Frank's house was a place of fear. Because he drank himself senseless and then terrorized his own children. Because when I tried to protect Beth from being locked in the dark, he hit me hard enough to bruise. Her voice shook but didn't break. I didn't leave lightly, Your Honor. I left because staying would have meant watching those girls suffer, and I couldn't do that. As for marrying Caleb so quickly, yes, it was strategic, but it was also something I'd have done regardless. He's the man I should have married 18 years ago. Life just gave us a second chance. The courtroom was silent. Judge Morrison studied her for a long moment, then turned his attention to Frank. Mr. Dalton, do you have anything to say in your own defense? Frank stood, his jaw tight. I love my daughters, Your Honor. I made a mistake, but I'm their father. They belong with me. Do they want to be with you? The question hung in the air. Frank's face flushed. They're children. They don't know what's best for them. Actually, Your Honor, if I may, Doc Whitmore stood. I've spent time with these girls over the past week. I've also known Frank Dalton for years. Before his wife died, he was a decent man. Since then, he's become someone even his own children fear. Those girls need safety and stability more than they need blood relation. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. I'm going to talk to the girls privately. Clara and Beth, would you come with me, please? The girls looked terrified, but Lydia gave them an encouraging nod and they stood, following the judge into his chambers. The doors closed behind them, and everyone was left waiting in tense silence. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Finally, the doors opened, and Judge Morrison emerged alone, the girls returning to sit beside Doc Whitmore. The judge's face was unreadable as he settled behind his bench. I've made my decision, he said heavily, and I'll be frank. This is one of the more difficult cases I've presided over. Mr. Dalton, you are the biological father, and under normal circumstances that would carry tremendous weight. However, the evidence presented, combined with what your daughters just told me, paints a troubling picture. They're afraid of you. Specifically, they're afraid of who you become when you drink, and that fear is not something I can ignore. Frank's face had gone pale. Your Honor, I'm not finished. Mrs. Harlan, while your actions in breaking the marriage contract are legally questionable, I'm not inclined to punish someone for leaving an abusive situation. The contract is void. You owe Mr. Dalton nothing. He paused, his gaze moving between all the parties. As for custody, I'm awarding temporary guardianship to Mr. and Mrs. Harlan for a period of 6 months. The courtroom erupted. Frank surged to his feet, Brennan grabbing his arm to hold him back. Behind them, Clara and Beth burst into tears, tears of relief. Lydia's hand found Caleb's and squeezed so hard it hurt. Order! Judge Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. I said temporary. Mr. Dalton, here are the terms. You will maintain complete sobriety for 6 months. You will meet weekly with someone qualified to help you process your grief and anger. You will have supervised visitation with your daughters twice a month. If, at the end of 6 months, you can demonstrate real change, real commitment to being the father these girls deserve, we'll revisit custody. If you cannot, guardianship will become permanent with the possibility of adoption by Mr. and Mrs. Harlan. Do you understand? Frank's jaw worked, fury and despair warring on his face. But finally, he nodded. Good. This hearing is adjourned. They left the courthouse in a daze, the weight of the decision still settling over them. Clara and Beth clung to Lydia, crying and laughing at the same time. Caleb shook Doc Whitmore's hand, thanking him for his testimony, and Frank watched from the courthouse steps, his expression unreadable, as they climbed into the wagon and drove away. The ride home was jubilant, the girls' fear finally breaking into genuine joy. They sang and chattered, making plans for the ranch, asking if they could have a dog, wondering if they could learn to ride horses properly. Lydia answered their questions with patient warmth, and Caleb drove with a smile he couldn't suppress. They reached the ranch as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. Caleb helped everyone down, and they stood together in the yard, looking at the cabin that was now, officially, legally, their home. We did it, Lydia whispered. We actually did it. We did, Caleb agreed, pulling her close. Welcome home, Mrs. Harlan. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears and laughter. Welcome home yourself, Mr. Harlan. That night, after the girls were asleep and the stars were bright overhead, Caleb and Lydia sat on the porch and let themselves finally believe it was real. They'd won. Not permanently, not yet, but enough. Enough to build on. Enough to hope. What happens now? Lydia asked. Now we live, Caleb said simply. We work the ranch. We raise those girls. We figure out how to be a family. And we see what Frank does with his 6 months. Do you think he'll change? I don't know, but that's his choice to make. All we can do is give Clara and Beth the childhood they deserve and hope that someday Frank becomes someone they can trust again. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they sat like that, until the moon rose high and full, watching over a family that had been broken and was slowly, carefully learning how to be whole. The first weeks after the hearing passed in a rhythm that felt almost too good to be real. Caleb would wake before dawn to the sound of movement in the kitchen. Lydia, already up, making coffee and preparing breakfast. He'd join her in the quiet morning light, and they'd work side by side in comfortable silence, stealing kisses when the girls weren't looking, learning the small intimacies of married life. Clara and Beth transformed before their eyes. The fear that had kept them silent and small began to fade, replaced by the natural curiosity and energy of children who felt safe. Beth started talking more, her voice growing stronger each day. Clara's nightmares became less frequent, and she began to smile. Really smile. Not the careful, placating expression she'd worn around her father. "Can we plant a garden?" Clara asked one morning at breakfast, her eyes bright with an idea. "Miss Moore, Mother." She stumbled over the word, looking to Lydia for permission. "You can call me Mother if you'd like," Lydia said softly, reaching over to squeeze the girl's hand. "I'd be honored." Clara's smile was radiant. "Mother, can we plant a garden? We could grow vegetables and maybe some flowers, too." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Lydia said, glancing at Caleb, "if your father agrees." The word still felt strange on her lips. Father, when referring to Caleb and these girls who weren't his by blood. But Clara and Beth had started using it naturally, and Caleb had never corrected them. If anything, he seemed to stand a little taller each time they said it. "A garden sounds perfect," Caleb said. "We'll need to clear some ground and fence it off to keep the rabbits out. But we can do that together." And they did. Over the following days, all four of them worked side by side, breaking ground in a sunny spot near the house, building a simple fence, preparing the soil. Lydia ordered seeds from the mercantile, tomatoes, beans, carrots, lettuce, and a selection of wildflowers that made Beth clap her hands with delight. The physical work was hard, but it felt good, purposeful. They were building something together, all of them, and with each fence post they set and each row they planted, the ranch felt more like home. Town proved more complicated. The first time Caleb brought Lydia and the girls into Willow Creek after the hearing, he could feel the weight of stares and whispers following them down Main Street. Mrs. Henderson made a point of sniffing disapprovingly as they passed. A few people crossed the street rather than greet them directly, but others surprised him. Sam Tucker came out of the mercantile to shake Caleb's hand and welcome Lydia warmly. Doc Whitmore stopped them on the boardwalk to check on the girls and tell Lydia she looked happier than he'd ever seen her. Even Judge Morrison, passing by in his carriage, tipped his hat with what might have been approval. "Let them talk," Lydia said quietly as they loaded supplies into the wagon. "We know the truth. That's what matters." "Doesn't it bother you, the gossip?" "Of course it does. But I've been gossiped about before, Caleb. When my family ran from our debts, when we moved from town to town, when I worked as a seamstress and lived in a boarding house with questionable reputation, people will always find reasons to talk." She looked at him, her expression fierce. "But this time I have something worth defending. I have you. I have those girls. I have a real home. Let them whisper all they want." He kissed her right there on Main Street, in full view of anyone who cared to watch, and when they broke apart, she was laughing. The supervised visits with Frank began in the third week. Judge Morrison had arranged for them to take place at Doc Whitmore's office, neutral ground with the doctor present to ensure everyone's safety. Caleb and Lydia brought the girls into town, their hearts heavy with apprehension, not knowing what to expect. Frank was waiting when they arrived, looking cleaner and more sober than Caleb had ever seen him. His hand shook slightly, from nerves or from alcohol withdrawal, Caleb couldn't tell, but his eyes were clear. When Clara and Beth entered the room, he didn't lunge for them or demand affection. He just stood there, looking at them with an expression that might have been longing or might have been regret. "Hello, girls," he said quietly. "Hello, Father," Clara said, her voice cautious. Beth said nothing, pressing close to Lydia's skirts. The visit lasted an hour. Frank asked them simple questions about the ranch, about their days, about what they were learning. He didn't try to justify his past behavior or make promises he couldn't keep. He just listened, and for the first time Caleb saw a glimpse of the man Frank might have been before grief had twisted him into something darker. When the hour ended, Frank stood slowly. "Thank you for bringing them. I know I don't deserve it." "You're their father," Lydia said carefully. "They deserve to know you, the real you, not the person alcohol made you become." Frank's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I'm trying. It's harder than I thought it would be. Being sober, I mean. Feeling everything instead of drowning it." "Keep trying," Caleb said, surprising himself. "Those girls need to see that people can change, that mistakes don't have to be permanent." As they left, Clara whispered to Lydia, "He seemed different, sad, but different." "People can change when they want to badly enough," Lydia told her. "Whether your father does or not, only time will tell." Spring deepened into summer, and the ranch flourished. The garden began producing vegetables faster than they could eat them, so Lydia started preserving and canning, teaching Clara the art while Beth played nearby, making up songs about tomatoes and beans. Caleb expanded the herd, using money he'd been saving for years, investing in the future he now had reason to believe in. The girls learned to ride, first on the gentle mare Caleb borrowed from a neighbor, then on a pony he bought specifically for them, a dappled gray named Clover, who had infinite patience with inexperienced riders. Beth named all the chickens and cried when one of them became dinner, so Caleb quietly bought more chickens and designated them as laying hens only, not for eating. "You're going soft," Lydia teased him one evening as they watched Beth feed the chickens, singing them a lullaby. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I've never been happier in my life, so I'm not complaining." She leaned into him, and they stood like that in the golden evening light, watching their daughters play. Daughters. The word had stopped feeling strange. Clara and Beth were theirs now, in every way that mattered, and each day that passed made the bond stronger. The monthly visits with Frank continued. Sometimes he seemed better, more present, more engaged with the girls. Other times he looked hollow, like a man barely holding himself together. But he never missed a visit. He never showed up drunk. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Clara and Beth began to relax around him. "He asked about school," Clara reported after one visit in late summer. "He asked if we were learning to read properly and if we liked arithmetic. He remembered that I used to like arithmetic." "That's good," Lydia said carefully. "That means he's thinking about you, really thinking, not just going through the motions." "Do you think he'll get better? Really better?" Lydia exchanged a glance with Caleb. They'd talked about this question many times, late at night when the girls were asleep. How much hope should they give? How honest should they be about the statistics that said most men like Frank never truly changed? "I think he's trying," Lydia said finally, "and that's more than he was doing before. Whether trying is enough, well, we'll find out when the 6 months are up." As summer faded into autumn, a new development changed everything. Lydia had been feeling unwell for weeks, tired, queasy, unable to keep breakfast down. At first she attributed it to the change in weather, or perhaps something she'd eaten. But when the symptoms persisted, Doc Whitmore confirmed what she'd begun to suspect. She was pregnant. Caleb's reaction when she told him was everything she could have hoped for, and more. He'd been in the barn when she found him, and when she spoke the words, he dropped the tools he was holding and pulled her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Doc confirmed it this morning. I'm about 8 weeks along, he thinks. Due in the spring." Caleb pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face, his eyes bright with tears he didn't bother to hide. "We're having a baby." "We're having a baby," she confirmed, laughing through her own tears. He kissed her then, tender and reverent, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "I love you. I love you so much, Lydia. I love you too. I love the life we've built. I love that we get to bring a child into this home we've made together." Telling the girls that evening was its own kind of joy. They'd gathered around the table after supper, and Lydia had taken a deep breath before speaking. "Clara, Beth, we have something to tell you. Something wonderful." Both girls looked up with curious eyes. "You're going to be big sisters," Caleb said, his voice warm. "Your mother is going to have a baby." For a moment, silence. Then Beth's face lit up like sunrise. "A baby? A real baby?" "A real baby," Lydia confirmed. "In the spring." Clara's expression was more complicated, joy mixed with something that might have been worry. Will you still have room for us when the baby comes? Lydia's heart broke a little at the question. She reached for Clara's hand, squeezing tight. Oh, sweetheart, of course. You're our daughters. Nothing will ever change that. The baby isn't replacing you. It's adding to our family, making it bigger and fuller and even more wonderful. But blood matters, Clara said quietly. Everyone says blood matters. And we're not really yours. Not like the baby will be. Caleb spoke then, his voice firm. Clara, look at me. Blood doesn't make a family. Love does. Showing up every day does. Caring for each other does. You and Beth are my daughters in every way that counts. The baby coming doesn't change that. It just means you'll get to teach someone all the things we've taught you. You'll get to show them how to be brave and kind and strong. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I'd like that. Teaching someone to be brave. Then that's what you'll do, Lydia said. You'll be the best big sisters any child could ask for. The 6-month deadline approached with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Frank's progress had been steady, but not dramatic. He'd maintained his sobriety, attended his counseling sessions, never missed a supervised visit. Doc Whitmore reported that the man seemed genuinely committed to change, but old patterns died hard, and grief and anger were wounds that took time to heal. The final hearing was scheduled for a cold November morning. Caleb and Lydia arrived at the courthouse with the girls, all of them dressed carefully, nervously. Frank was already there with his lawyer, and Caleb was struck by how different the man looked. Thinner, yes, but also more solid somehow, less hollowed out by rage and alcohol. Judge Morrison called the hearing to order with his usual formality. We're here to review the temporary guardianship arrangement and determine permanent custody of Clara and Beth Dalton. Mr. Dalton, I've read the reports from your counselor and from Doc Whitmore. By all accounts, you've fulfilled the requirements I set. You've remained sober, you've engaged in treatment, and you've maintained regular visitation. Is that accurate? Yes, Your Honor, Frank said. His voice was steady, but Caleb could see the tension in his shoulders. And how do you feel about your daughter's current living situation? Frank was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving to where Clara and Beth sat behind Caleb and Lydia. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. They're thriving, anyone can see that. Clara's reading at a higher level than she was 6 months ago. Beth talks now, really talks, about things she likes and dreams she has. They're not afraid anymore. He paused, swallowing hard. They're not afraid, and that's because they're with people who know how to love them properly, who don't turn into monsters when life gets hard. Are you saying you want to relinquish custody? Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose. I'm saying I want what's best for my daughters, and I've had 6 months to realize that what's best for them isn't necessarily being with me. Frank's hands clenched on the table in front of him. I love them, I always have, but loving them means accepting that I broke something when Mary died. I broke me, and in breaking me, I broke them too. Mr. and Mrs. Harlan, they're fixing what I broke, and I can't— His voice cracked. I can't take them away from that just because my pride says they should be with their blood father. The courtroom was silent. Lydia reached for Caleb's hand, squeezing hard. Judge Morrison leaned forward. Mr. Dalton, are you formally relinquishing your parental rights? No, Your Honor. I'm asking for something different. Frank looked at Caleb and Lydia directly for the first time. I want them to have parents who can care for them the way they deserve, but I want to stay in their lives, not as their father, as someone who loves them, an uncle maybe, or a family friend, someone they can visit without fear, someone who can watch them grow up and know that his biggest accomplishment was letting them go to something better. Caleb felt his throat tighten. He'd expected a fight, had prepared arguments and evidence. He hadn't expected this, Frank surrendering not out of defeat but out of love. Mr. and Mrs. Harlan, Judge Morrison said, how would you feel about such an arrangement? Caleb looked at Lydia, and in her eyes he saw the same mixture of surprise and compassion he felt. She nodded slightly, and he stood. Your Honor, we'd be willing to work out an arrangement. Regular visits, holidays, birthdays. We want the girls to know their biological father. We want them to see that he cared enough to put their needs above his pride. That's a powerful lesson. Clara suddenly stood, her voice small but clear. Your Honor, may I say something? Of course, young lady. Father, she looked at Frank. You hurt us. You scared us. For a long time, I didn't think I could ever forgive you. But you've changed. I can see it. And I think... She glanced at Beth, who nodded encouragingly. I think we'd like to know you, not living with you, but knowing you, if that makes sense. Frank's face crumpled, and for a moment Caleb thought the man might break down entirely, but he held himself together, nodding once. Judge Morrison sat back, a slight smile on his weathered face. Well then, seems we've reached an agreement that everyone can live with. I'm making the guardianship permanent, Mr. and Mrs. Harlan, you are now the legal guardians of Clara and Beth Dalton, with full parental rights and responsibilities. Mr. Dalton, you'll retain visitation rights, unsupervised, given your progress, but scheduled through the Harlans. Does everyone agree to these terms? Yes, Your Honor, came the chorus of voices. Then this hearing is concluded, and may I say... The judge's stern expression softened. This is how the legal system is supposed to work. Everyone putting the children's needs first. I'm proud of all of you. They left the courthouse into weak November sunshine. Frank stood on the steps, looking uncertain, and Lydia surprised everyone by approaching him. Thank you, she said quietly. What you did in there, putting them first, that took courage. Frank's eyes were red-rimmed. I just want them to be happy. I want them to have what I couldn't give them. You gave them life, Lydia said, and you gave them the chance at something better. That's not nothing, Frank. He nodded, unable to speak, then crouched down as Clara and Beth approached cautiously. Can we hug you? Beth asked, her voice small. Frank's answer was lost in tears as both girls wrapped their arms around him. It was brief, but it was genuine, and when they pulled away, something had shifted. Forgiveness, perhaps, or at least the beginning of it. Winter settled over the prairie with a gentleness that belied its reputation. Snow came in soft dustings rather than blizzards, and the cabin stayed warm with the fire Caleb kept burning. Lydia's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her belly rounding under layers of wool and flannel. Clara and Beth hovered over her protectively, bringing her tea and asking endless questions about babies. Christmas came, and they celebrated simply, gifts made by hand, a tree decorated with paper chains and popcorn strings, carols sung around the fire. Frank joined them for dinner, bringing carved wooden toys he'd made for the girls and a cradle for the coming baby that made Lydia cry. I worked on it for weeks, he said gruffly. Figured the least I could do was make sure my grandbaby... He stopped, correcting himself. Your baby has somewhere safe to sleep. It's beautiful, Frank, Caleb said, examining the craftsmanship. Really beautiful. Thank you. It was the first holiday any of them had spent without fear or tension, and the peace of it felt like its own kind of miracle. Winter melted into spring, and with the warming weather came new life. The garden that Clara had planted months ago began showing green shoots. The cattle produced healthy calves. And on a morning when the prairie was covered in wildflowers and the sky was impossibly blue, Lydia's labor began. Doc Whitmore arrived within the hour, calm and efficient, while Caleb paced the cabin like a caged animal. Clara and Beth had been sent to stay with Sam Tucker and his wife, sparing them the worry, leaving Caleb alone with his fear and his prayers to anyone who might be listening. The labor was long, longer than Doc would have liked, but by late afternoon, a baby's cry filled the cabin. Caleb rushed into the bedroom to find Lydia exhausted but smiling, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. It's a boy, she said, her voice hoarse. We have a son. Caleb sank onto the edge of the bed, tears streaming freely down his face as he looked at the impossibly small person they'd created together. His son. Their son. He's perfect, he whispered. Lydia, he's perfect. What should we name him? They discussed names for months, running through options and rejecting most of them. But as Caleb looked at his son's face, red and wrinkled and more beautiful than anything he'd ever seen, one name felt right. Thomas, he said, after your father. Lydia's father had been a complicated man, but he'd given her life, and in his own way, he'd loved his children. Naming their son after him felt like honoring the complicated nature of family, the way love and pain could exist side by side, the way people could fail and still deserve to be remembered. Thomas Harlan, Lydia said, testing the name. Yes, that's right. Clara and Beth met their baby brother that evening, approaching with awe and wonder. Beth reached out a tentative finger to touch his tiny hand, and when Thomas's fingers curled around hers, her face lit up with pure joy. He's holding me, she breathed. He knows I'm his sister. Of course he does, Lydia said softly. You're his big sister. He's going to look up to you his whole life. The first months of Thomas's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. Caleb discovered that he could function on almost no sleep if it meant rocking his son, watching him discover his own hands, hearing those first gurgles that would eventually become words. Clara and Beth were devoted big sisters, fighting over who got to hold him, singing to him when he cried, reporting every small achievement to anyone who would listen. Frank visited regularly, always bringing something he'd made or grown, always respectful of boundaries. He held Thomas with careful reverence, and sometimes Caleb caught him watching the whole family with an expression that was equal parts sorrow and peace. Frank would never have back what he'd lost, but he'd found a way to be part of something good despite his failures. That was its own kind of redemption. The years that followed were marked by the ordinary milestones that make up a life. Thomas took his first steps, spoke his first words, grew from baby to toddler to boy. Clara blossomed into a thoughtful young woman who talked about becoming a teacher someday, just like Lydia had once dreamed. Beth discovered a talent for drawing, filling pages with sketches of horses and prairie flowers in her family. The ranch prospered. Caleb expanded the herd further, hired help during busy seasons, began to make a real living rather than just surviving. Lydia started teaching Clara, Beth, and eventually Thomas their letters and numbers, turning the cabin into a makeshift schoolhouse some mornings. She talked about opening a real school someday, and Caleb was already setting aside money to make that dream possible. 3 years after Thomas's birth, Lydia discovered she was pregnant again. This time a daughter arrived, with Lydia's dark hair and Caleb's eyes, and they named her Mary, after Frank's first wife, because forgiveness and remembrance could coexist, and because the girls deserved to know their mother's name would live on in joy rather than just loss. Life wasn't perfect. There were hard seasons when the cattle market dropped, winters when illness swept through the family, moments of frustration and exhaustion and doubt. But there was also laughter ringing through the cabin, children's footsteps thundering across the porch, Lydia's voice singing as she worked, Caleb's arms strong and steady around his growing family. One evening, nearly 5 years after that day at the depot, Caleb stood on his porch watching the sun set over his land. Lydia joined him, baby Mary on her hip, and they stood in comfortable silence watching their children play. Clara teaching Beth to braid Thomas's hair while he squirmed and protested, all three of them laughing. "Do you ever think about how different it could have been?" Lydia asked quietly. "If I'd married Frank, if you hadn't been at the depot that day?" "Sometimes," Caleb admitted, "but not with regret. If things had gone differently, we wouldn't have this. Exactly this. These children, this moment, this life." "Frank told me last week that he's courting someone," Lydia said. "A widow from the next county. He seems happy, nervous, but happy." "Good for him. Everyone deserves a second chance." "Even us?" Caleb turned to look at her, this woman who'd been his first love and his last, who'd disappeared and returned, who'd given him everything he'd ever wanted without even knowing that was what she was doing. "Especially us," he said, pulling her close. "We didn't get a second chance, Lydia. We got our first chance, finally. After 18 years of waiting, we got to live the life we were always meant to live." She leaned into him, Mary cooing between them, and they watched the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson while their children played and the prairie wind carried the scent of growing things and possibility. The depot where it all began was 12 miles south, but Caleb rarely thought of it anymore. That frozen moment when he'd seen Lydia step off the train had changed everything, yes, but what mattered wasn't the shock or the pain or the desperate scramble that followed. What mattered was that they'd fought for each other, that they'd chosen each other over and over again through every challenge and complication, that they'd taken broken pieces, two people scarred by loss, two children afraid of their own father, a future that seemed impossible, and built something whole. Sometimes, late at night when the cabin was quiet and his family slept safely around him, Caleb would lie awake and marvel at the sheer improbability of it all. That Lydia had answered Frank's advertisement, that she'd chosen Willow Creek of all places, that he'd been at the depot at exactly the right moment, that despite every obstacle, they'd found their way back to each other. But maybe it wasn't improbability. Maybe it was simply what was always meant to happen. Two people who loved each other at 16, separated by circumstance, given a second chance by fate and their own stubborn refusal to give up on the possibility of happiness. Years later, when Clara was grown and planning her own wedding, she asked Caleb how he'd known Lydia was the one. He thought about it for a long moment, then smiled. I knew the first time I kissed her, by a creek in Missouri when we were too young to know anything about anything. I knew because even when she was gone, even when I tried to forget, she was still the one. Some things you just know, Clara. They settle in your bones and stay there, waiting for their moment to become real. That's what happened with you and Mother? It just waited? It waited, Caleb confirmed. For 18 years it waited. And then one day she stepped off a train and everything I'd been waiting for finally arrived. Do you think everyone has someone like that? Someone who changes everything? Caleb looked at his eldest daughter, this girl who wasn't his by blood, but was his in every way that mattered, and chose his words carefully. I think some people spend their whole lives searching and never find it. I think some people find it and let it go. And I think some people, if they're very lucky and very brave, get a second chance at something they thought they'd lost forever. The key is recognizing it when it comes and fighting like hell to keep it. Clara hugged him tight. I'm glad Mother stepped off that train. I'm glad you were there. I'm glad you fought for her. For us. Me too, sweetheart. Every single day, me too. The sun set on the Harlan Ranch that evening like it had thousands of evenings before and would thousands of evenings after. Inside the cabin, Lydia called everyone to dinner. Thomas and Mary thundered in from wherever they'd been playing, arguing good-naturedly about something insignificant. Beth showed off her latest drawing. Clara helped serve food, already practicing for her own household someday. And Caleb sat at the head of the table he'd built with his own hands, in the cabin he'd raised from nothing, surrounded by the family he'd fought for and won, and knew with absolute certainty that every lonely year, every moment of doubt, every night spent wondering if happiness was even possible, all of it had been worth it to arrive at this moment. His first kiss had been beside a creek with a girl who tasted like strawberries and hope. His last kiss would be with that same girl, grown into a woman, a wife, a mother, his partner in building a life that neither of them could have imagined when they were young. The cowboy who'd frozen at the depot when he saw his mail-order bride was long gone, replaced by a man who knew what it meant to love and be loved, to build and protect, to take what fate offered and make it into something beautiful. And the woman who'd stepped off that train, desperate and afraid and running toward what she thought was her only option, had found instead her first and last love, waiting for her exactly where he'd always been, 12 miles away from where she'd been heading, in a life she'd never dared imagine, but exactly where she was always meant to be. They lived the rest of their lives on that prairie ranch, through seasons and years, through joy and sorrow, through the ordinary miracles that make up a well-lived life. And when people asked how they'd found each other, they'd share a look, the kind of look that only people who've loved the same person for 40 years can share, and say simply, we were lucky. And when luck gave us a chance, we didn't let go. That was enough. That was everything. And it was the life they were always meant to live. The end.